Welcome to the Ayaan Hirsi podcast, a home for common sense and critical thinking. Today on the podcast, I'm honored to welcome Lieutenant General retired H.R. McMaster. General McMaster is the Fouad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. He's also the Bernard and Susan Liautaud Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and lecturer at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. He serves as the Japan Chair at the Hudson Institute and Chairman of the Center for Political and Military Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. He was the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. General McMaster served as a commissioned officer in the United States Army for 34 years after graduation from West Point. He holds a PhD in military history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is author of Battlegrounds, A Fight to Defend the Free World, and Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. He is host of the podcast Battlegrounds, International Perspectives on Crucial Challenges to Security and Prosperity. Okay, HR, welcome to my podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know that you are incredibly famous, but I don't know if everybody knows you. So just give me a brief bio of your amazing history.
Well, no, you have an amazing history. I just wanted you to know how much I admire your courage and your example and the courage of your scholarship as well. I've benefited so much from it and from your perspectives, and it's an honor to be with you. I guess I should just say I'm a washed up general. You know, I was in the Army for 34 years. I graduated from West Point, and the Army was a great opportunity for me. I mean, I loved every minute of it. You get a chance to serve alongside courageous young men and women who are dedicated to each other and dedicated to missions larger than themselves. And the Army afforded me an opportunity to study history and to teach history. And so upon retirement, I have made it my mission here at the Hoover Institution to do my best to foster a deeper, more full understanding of the greatest challenges and opportunities that we face internationally as a way to help bring Americans together around a common agenda that I think should aim to build a better future for generations to come.
And in terms of challenges and opportunities in this time that you served, what would you say were the biggest challenges that we've overcome?
Well, I think that when I went into the job as National Security Advisor, this is 2017, the first thing I tried to do was to identify, what are the greatest challenges to national and international security? And we organized efforts to frame these complex challenges, understand them better, and then to come up with options for the president that involve the integration of all elements of national power, right? Diplomatic efforts, military efforts, law enforcement efforts, economic efforts, intelligence efforts, and the efforts of like-minded partners, right? To overcome obstacles to progress and to help build a better future. And of course, I would say that foremost among these was the threat from the Chinese Communist Party that was deploying a pernicious strategy against us, a strategy that I've described as one of co-option, coercion, and concealment. We also had to cope with, the threat from Russia and Vladimir Putin's really drive to restore Russia to national greatness, and to do so by dragging everybody else down in the free world with this campaign of disruption and disinformation and denial. Yeah. And Ayaan, as you're very much aware, we have other problems as well. We have hostile states of Iran has been waging a 4-decade-long proxy war against us, and the threat from North Korea, the only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world that is pursuing the most destructive weapons on earth. And then of course we have the problem of jihadist terrorism, which you've written about, and that a problem that is a long-term problem. And what concerns me these days, Ayaan, is this drive to disengage from what our enemies are waging as an endless jihad, right? We have the mantra, end the endless wars. But of course, as we know, wars don't end when one party disengages, and threats from jihadist terrorism that develop abroad can only be dealt with, as we should have learned from the tragedy and the horror of 9/11. They can only be dealt with at an exorbitant cost once they reach our shores.
Right. The subtext of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, listening to the Biden administration, is, look, the jihadi threat, it's now a little bit of a nuisance. We really should be focusing on these bigger threats, such as China and Russia. Is that conclusion justified?
No, it's self-delusion. It's self-delusion. And everything that I've heard out of the Biden administration is based on a pretend world. It's not the real world. And I think the first step that we have to make, right, to defend, our nation and all civilized people, all humanity against this threat, is to stop pretending. Yeah. Stop pretending. I mean, think of what we've said about the Taliban, that they're separate from other jihadist terrorists. Suraj Haqqani, who is at the head of the Haqqani network, an organization completely interconnected, intertwined with Al Qaeda, is the head of security now for the Taliban government. I mean, all you need to know, if you think that maybe the Taliban is just this kind of rural movement that isn't interested in physical jihad against anybody that doesn't adhere to their, to their belief that we ought to all go back to the 7th century, is to know that the supreme leader of the Taliban, Hibatullah Akhundzada, his son was a suicide bomber at the age of 17.
Right.
So we keep trying to mirror image these people and act like, well, you hear these phrases from the Secretary of State. Well, it's not in the Taliban's interest. Hey, I mean, the newsflash is they're not motivated by interest. They're motivated by ideology.
Yes.
And what I would describe, and I know you describe it a bit differently, Ayaan, based on your experience in living it, but I describe it as a perverted interpretation of Islam that they use to justify their criminal acts. And they used to justify the pursuit of really a political objective, which is, in this case, is to establish the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which we have handed to them by self-defeat. And a victory for the Taliban is a victory for other jihadist terrorists. We have to stop pretending that that is not the case.
And the reason is their ideology, whether it's derived from Islam or whether it is falsified Islam. I think it is. We can just leave. You and I can continue to have that conversation. I think it's really productive. And by the way, I have to congratulate you on many of your achievements in maintaining that it's really a perverted form of Islam. You've been able to win over Muslims who were on the fence about which way to go. So that is, I think that's a huge achievement. And from a strategic perspective, I think that's a great approach. Tony Blair says also they are driven by ideology and their conviction, and they have a worldview that they are committed to. And we now are led by an administration, and it's not just this administration. There are people, our leaders, political leaders, economic leaders, and so on, who do engage in a different kind of ideology that's self-delusional. And so when I go back to the question of what is really the biggest challenge we face today, it's probably not China. It's probably not Russia. It's probably this homegrown ideology that allows people to engage in this type of pretend world.
Yeah, right. And I think that I would describe it as a combination of self-loathing on the far left, in which the people define the problems in the world as us, right? As if we've created these enemies and adversaries, and just think about how arrogant that is, right? That basically says the jihadist terrorists, right? The Chinese Communist Party, Vladimir Putin and the leaders around him in the Kremlin, they don't have any aspirations beyond those that are in reaction to what we do. And of course, we know that's not the case. And then I would also say that there's a problem on what I would call kind of maybe the bigoted neo-isolationist far right, right? That also, and both of them see our disengagement from complex problem sets abroad as an unmitigated good. Yeah. And the reason they do that is for what I call in the book Battlegrounds, strategic narcissism, which is the tendency to define the world only in relation to us, and then to assume that what we do is decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. And the problem with that is it's self-referential, and it doesn't acknowledge the agency, the influence, and the authorship over the future that others have.
Absolutely. And it also doesn't acknowledge anything about human history. it insists that we're not exceptional. And if we're exceptional at anything, we're exceptional at being really the bad guys, systemically racist and waging never-ending wars. And yeah, you're right about the self-loathing. One thing that I really worry about and that alarmed me was the purging of people like you from military boards. If you were, and people like you would influence the curriculums, and especially the understanding of history of our military, then I think our decline is accelerated in that case. And, you know, China and Russia, they don't have it. All they have to do is just wait us out.
Well, and this is a problem, right? I mean, people worried about Donald Trump politicizing the military, you know, by saying like my generals and that sort of thing, and the Joe Milley, you know, walking across Lafayette Square and so forth. But I think this is even much worse. What President Biden did. I think it's worth pointing out that where you might disagree with some of the 11th hour sort of Trump appointments to these boards, you know, they were valid appointments, and each of these people had a different perspective to bring. What I think was interesting, Ayaan, is that the White House spokesperson said, hey, you know, President Biden has the right to appoint people to boards whose views align with his. Hey, that's not what boards are for. Right? Boards are to give leaders the benefit of a diverse range of perspectives. The Trump administration didn't dismiss all the Obama administration appointees to these boards when it came in. They actually served out their terms. And so I think Americans ought to be concerned about this. I think, you know, fits a pattern though, Ayaan. So remember, America's back, right? Remember that saying, America's back, and you know, we're back for Europe and everything. Mm-hmm. Well, remember the outrage that people had about Donald Trump's mean tweets, you know, about European allies? Hey, well, how about leaving European civilians behind in the humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan? I think maybe that was maybe even more offensive than a mean tweet. So I think what the problem with this administration is, I think they have achieved extraordinary levels of hypocrisy. Yeah. Everything that they say is a priority, they do the opposite. So in the same speech that President Biden said that he was going to adhere to the withdrawal from Afghanistan timeline, even if it left American citizens behind. And even though we knew we were going to leave Afghans behind who'd worked for us and who were already being murdered and abused in horrible ways, he then said, well, you know, human rights is going to be a real foundational to our policy. Yeah. You know, women's rights. I mean, it's actually laughable, Ayaan. I think we have to demand more from our political leaders and call them on it, and not do it in a partisan way. This is, I mean, I'm not making a partisan argument here, because you know, Donald Trump was loose with the facts, right, and was erratic in a lot of ways. Yeah. But remember how they had that tally of, you know, everything Trump said and what was wrong. Hey, let's apply that to the Biden administration too, right? Right. Yeah. And I think because our media, our press have stopped doing their job of being critical to every administration, not just the Republican administrations, but also Democratic administrations, that then there is no self-correcting mechanism within that group. And from that outlook, everything is seen to be right. So Trump purging, he didn't do it. But if he were to purge Obama's people from the military and from boards, that would be seen as typically Trump, crazy and divisive and erratic. But when they do it, it's self-righteous. Well, you know, it's interesting. I mean, of course, I was one of the purge E's from these boards, from the board of the United States Military Academy, under the basis that maybe I wasn't qualified, I guess, you know. But anyway, what's interesting is when I was National Security Advisor, there were members of the Trump administration who wanted to purge everybody from the National Security Council staff who had served under the Obama administration. Now, these were not political appointees, right? These were long-serving civil servants and foreign service areas officers and intelligence professionals and so forth. Yeah. And I refused to do it, right? Yeah. I refused to do it. Of course, it's like turning out the lights and groping in the dark. And also, though, I thought it would be a disservice to the president, right? Because it would have created, I think, a controversy that he didn't need, and for no good reason. In fact, many of these people, like many of these board members, right, their terms were about to expire, like in December. Right. So they decided to make a statement with this, and I think what we've done is maybe we've underappreciated the degree to which this so-called progressive agenda is foundational to the Biden administration, in the areas of foreign policy. I'm not really good at domestic policy and so forth, even though, I'm on good fellows with Neil First and John Cochran. Like we're going to film one today, and I'll be kind of quiet, because it's about California politics. But I think that it carries over to foreign policy, and it's a progressive agenda. Hey, Ayaan, what is a foreign policy for the middle class? What does that mean? I don't understand that.
Yeah.
I mean, shouldn't our foreign policy, benefit all classes and races and geographic areas right? I mean, I don't understand it. So they always want to break everything down into different identity groups. And you've written so well about this and about how dangerous it is.
It's very dangerous and it's distracting. And I think when I wholeheartedly agree with you that we need to get their attention and do it in a bipartisan way and do it for our country. And would it help if we then really talked about the real threats that we face? For instance, the threat from China, the withdrawal. A lot of people ask and have assumed the way we did it. I think whether we should have withdrawn or not, that is genuinely a controversial issue, and there are people who fall on either side. I understand that. But if you then go with withdrawal and the way we did it, what is to stop China now from marching into Taiwan? And if China did that, what would we do?
And you've already seen it just in the past several days. You've seen statements by the Chinese Communist Party that they're threatening to patrol Taiwan airspace, right? To fly Chinese fighters routinely over Taiwan. If you have the stomach to read the China Daily, right, which is their propaganda piece, there was an op-ed in there that was right on this topic that said, "Hey, Taiwan, do you really think America's going to come, to your defense?" So they're already fighting a psychological battle to try to diminish Taiwanese will to defend themselves,
right,
and to create the idea that they're isolated from international support. On the other hand, though, you have the administration, I think, being unnecessarily provocative toward the Chinese Communist Party with some of these declarations now of meetings that always happen but never happen publicly, and some of the changes in the name of the Taiwanese diplomatic presence in the United States in ways that are kind of slaps in the face of the Chinese Communist Party, which I'm okay with, right? But hey, if you're but instead of speaking softly and carrying a big stick, as Theodore Roosevelt mentioned, they're speaking loudly, and I think they're carrying a small stick,
tiny stick,
will.
Right. And engaging in that just nonsensical stuff. Another threat is Tony Blair described this just horror show of the threat of bioterror that would be used by, say, pre-emerging jihadi groups that are also, now they see that they have an opportunity. God forbid if something as horrible as that were to happen. Are we ready for it?
Well, decades ago, there was this attempt by, remember the Japanese terrorist group, to use chemical weapons in subways and so forth. And we know that jihadist terrorists, this is in open reporting, are pursuing biological weapons. They're also pursuing the most destructive weapons on earth, nuclear weapons and atomic weapons or dirty bombs. And so this is why it's very, very important to keep terrorist groups more concerned about their own safety and security than they are about what they're going to do to you. Because once they control safe havens and support bases and sources of revenue, they can begin to develop these capabilities. And I would add offensive cyber capabilities that they're trying to develop also. They're a little bit behind in that, certainly relative to nation states, but that's not going to stay that way forever, right? And so it's really important, to understand, I think, that threats from jihadist terrorists, again, can only be dealt with at an exorbitant cost once they reach our shores. That should have been a lesson, of 9/11, and it should be a lesson even of COVID, right? Yes. I mean, this pandemic, moved from an epidemic to a pandemic because the Chinese Communist Party didn't allow us to deal with it abroad, right? Yeah. And through the lies and obfuscation and persecuting anybody who was trying to ring the alarm bells about it.
Do you think that China and Russia, Putin, are irresponsible enough if they knew? Now we know that at least they have one safe haven in Afghanistan under the leadership of the Taliban. And they have another safe haven in Iran. That's a regime that's been trying for a very long time to develop nuclear weapons and other types of weapons. But would the Chinese and Russians be so irresponsible as to provide them with the know-how to do that? I know they don't have the know-how. The jihadis don't have that, but they could acquire it.
Well, we know already that these groups share, they share technologies. For example, remember the bombing of the Syrian nuclear weapons facility in 2007 by the Israeli Defense Force? Yeah. That was a nuclear facility that was staffed by North Korean scientists. Where did those North Korean scientists get their know-how? We think probably from some Russian programs, maybe even in some in former Ukraine in connection with missile capabilities in particular, but also, the AQ Khan network, right? The Pakistani Proliferation Network. So, when you have, authoritarian regimes that are hostile to us, I think oftentimes they act against their own interests, right? Yeah. Just to gain a competitive advantage against us. It's not in China's interest, you would think, that the Kim family regime have nuclear weapons. But of course, China prioritizes using North Korea as a wedge to drive us out of Northeast Asia as the first step in isolating their regional rival, Japan, over the denuclearization of North Korea. So, I think it's a possibility. And this is why, really keeping our eye on the non-proliferation regime is super important. And even with our adversaries like China and Russia, to have, heart-to-heart conversations and say, okay, listen, this is not in your interest either. And there are certain, certain areas where we have to work together. Putin, though, I'll tell you, I think Putin will act against the United States, even if those actions cut against his interests. I mean, we've seen many examples of this. Yeah. By arming the Taliban, supporting the Taliban, for example. And so I don't think you can't look at these rivals as through a mirror image of a rational actor, right? Or the reasonable man theory of English common law, right? Yeah. These are people who are driven by emotions and ideology and aspirations.
Right. And then I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask you one final question, and that is, given the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also the tense relations under Donald Trump, to what extent have we damaged relations with our allies? And our allies is not only Europe, but also Australia, New Zealand, and India.
Yeah, I think the damage is significant, and it's going to take, I think, many years to begin to efface the stain of 2001. And we have to begin now, and the only way we're going to be successful is with our actions, not just words, right? We just can't strive for a better atmosphere at cocktail parties in Paris and Berlin. We have to actually work together on concrete challenges that we face, those associated with Chinese economic coercion and Chinese unfair trade and economic practices and industrial espionage, those associated with Russia's sustained campaign of political subversion against Europe, the United States, and the West, those associated with jihadist terrorism and non-proliferation and the issues we've been discussing, offensive cyber threats. So we have to really show that we are not a competent partner who also has the will to see these efforts through.
I couldn't agree with you more. I will leave it at that. Obviously, I'm brimming with more and more questions, but this was super interesting. So I'll say thank you. And I will listen to you at Goodfellows. And thank you for your service. And thank you for everything.
Ayaan, thanks. Hey, I love your podcast and I love you. It's great to be with you.
And I love you. I love you, Katie. Okay. We'll see you soon. Thank you for listening to the Ayaan Hirsi Ali podcast. If you like what you've heard, please consider giving my podcast a rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, and until next time.